Okay, so we are on slide 18. So we have about 10 more left in the presentation. So, Eystein, if you can give us as quick of what we did last, um, a little review of what we covered last time, just to get everybody on the same page. And then we'll get through the last bit of the slides and then we can have our discussion. And the mic is yours.
Thank you. So can you all hear me okay?
I can hear you. Yep.
That's very good. um, so let's go back a few slides and do a very, very quick run through. I think it's like more like 6 going back, just to get to the beginning of the curves. There you go. So we were talking last time. I didn't see if we have any new names here, but just to do a quick recap. So this is a typical curve. If somebody tries to do like a Scott Rao style roasting, doing a linear roar, this is typically what happens, which is basically the coffee expressing itself. This is like a non-compensated behavior. The coffee does what it's been pre-programmed to do. And we see a lot of this, especially in naturals. So let's go one more slide. Let's go forward. So this is just to break things down and make it easier to see. This is the bean temperature curve. And it looks very, very smooth and very nice, which is why we have the next curve to give us more information. So this is the air temperature curve in my roaster, both in the Cava, which is a sample roaster, and in my production roaster. I have the measure the coffee. So you can see a great communication between sensors, and you can have a good idea of how much energy you're putting in. So this is the air temperature. You can see it goes quite high. And that at the end, it has a bit of a bump to give more energy into the roast because the coffee demands that. So environment temperature curve. Let's go one forward. So this is the energy in the roast. Basically, we're measuring how many degrees we are decreasing or at what speed we're going at any given second. So you can see that even though the bean temperature curve looks really, really smooth, and the air temperature curve does its loop-to-loop, because it's quite variable since it has no thermal, let's call it, it doesn't have as much memory because there's not as much mass to it. But here we can really see a lot of information. We can see that we hit a roar peak at the beginning, that we could have gone a bit lower and could have sustained it a little bit better. As we get to the middle of the roast, where the drying phase starts around 150 degrees, you can see that we have a slight changing in energy, that we go up a tiny bit. This tells us that this coffee has been slightly overcharged for a little while, and the water evaporating from the coffee was masking this effect from the bean temperature sensor. So that happens quite a lot, that the energy that the water steals creates a lot of difficulties during roasting. And my job as a roaster is to become the shock absorber between the heat I'm giving to the coffee that I try to adjust to the right rate of rise at any given moment, because the tolerance of the coffee changes. And then we have the evaporation profile, which should be the next slide. Here we have all of them together, so we can see how they correlate. We can see, for example, that after when the roar curve in the middle starts going up, it kind of changes gears and goes a bit faster, we can see that the air temperature continued to rise. So my guess is that we should have gone a bit lower on the drop temperature to not have the same peak, go into something that we could sustain better, go up a bit higher in the gas earlier on, and then coming in towards the middle, 6 minutes, already lower a bit earlier, because we're supercharging this coffee. So we need to change our dynamics a tiny bit. And then as we try to lose energy towards the end of the roast, we're actually losing a bit too fast because we supercharged it. So every time you have creating a valley in the curve where the energy goes down, you're losing complexity. So this is the representation of what destabilizes the roast so much, which is basically the evaporation curve. And this is the only curve in the presentation that isn't a real curve. This is something that I've drawn from research that I've done from other curves that I've seen. There are some Icavas around that have evaporation curves and some other instruments that can help us with this. But this is basically it, to show that you have increasing evaporation until about 1/3, and then you go into a plateau state. This plateau state is not that clean. It actually varies quite a bit. But then it basically goes exponential at the end because the the beans start popping, they expand, a lot more surface area becomes available, a lot more energy goes in, a lot faster, and we have a lot of vapor being being made available inside the system. So the cooling effect of this is like incredible. So here you see the gas curve, which is what we all the micro adjustments that we made here. There's lots of adjustments below half a millibar. And then a little rise at the end, which is to help with this unified crack that releases a lot of moisture all at once. If you didn't do this, our coffees would have like hardly any body, mouthfeel would be really missing, and we would lose a lot of solubility. And solubility is important here because we have really difficult water, lots of metals in the water, so it's difficult. So let's go forward until where we dropped off the last time, which is here. So this was all about how we've looked a bit on how coffee reacts. We looked a bit on how the beans reacts when they're being roasted. And now we're going to take a quick look at how I check to see if my roaster is giving me trouble because my recipes are not respecting my roaster. So a while back, from a lot of frustration, I decided to start roasting air with my recipes, roasting nothing in the cava to see what the recipes were provoking in the coffees and what was actually behavior from the coffee. So as I started roasting air and testing all my recipes, I saw that some of them worked really well and some of them didn't work at all. And then I started adjusting all these recipes to make them run well just with air. And then I would start running coffee and seeing what the coffee did. So that means I could upload into my Cropster account all these roasts and start doing comparisons, doing cuppings, see what happens to flavor. And what I found is that apart from the fact that the coffee actually has a bit of lift, since it has mass, it has energy stored, at some point you can see the green curve here is roasting air. So you can see that it starts higher because it has no mass, and it also ends lower in temperature in the same, this is an inlet curve. So it ends lower because it has no thermal mass, it has no memory carrying it. There's no thermal inertia happening. So it actually gets to a lesser temperature at the end. You can see, for example, if you have dips in your recipe, you're roasting just air, this dip will be huge when you're roasting coffee. So you smoothen all these things out and you get a marvelous transparency in your coffee, which is really, really nice. It really helps you. It really helps you read. Now this curve is very, very far from a smooth roar descent. So what I'm doing here is something very close to what I'm doing with my production roaster. I've been doing mostly 11-minute roasts, maybe up to 12 these last couple of years because the weather hasn't really permitted doing any more than that. When the coffee doesn't have as much complexity because it has suffered from drought, from high temperatures, from aborted development and all these things. It needs more time to generate more flavor. We have to make more because it doesn't have as much. So we've had like 3-4 years of lots of difficulties here in Brazil, and the coffee quality has just been going down. The good thing is we're oscillating into a better year. It's not a high yield year for most people. There's not too defects, especially when it comes to problems with heat and arrested development. So, but the harvest seems really nice. And this recipe has been working really well, going from the old harvest to the new harvest with hardly any adjustments. I made some adjustments over the last days because I was roasting coffee from 1,550 meters of altitude that had taken like 35 days to dry. And this gives you a really, really dense bean. So I remade my recipes for more energy the same time. And I actually found out that these recipes are so stable that it doesn't much matter if I roast 40 grams, 50 grams, or 60 grams.
Hey, Eystein,
The coffee, yeah,
are these all inlet curves or the bean temp?
yeah, these are all inlet curves.
Okay.
I haven't used a bean temperature curve for, I don't know, 5 years because they're very, very unstable. It's very difficult to make a good representation of the roar and get it the way you want running a bean temperature curve.
Okay.
I'd go as far to say as if you only roast with a bean temperature curve in the cava, you're creating so much mess, you're not really seeing your coffee. So this is my way of testing. If I'm impacting my roaster in a negative way, or if I'm impacting my coffee in a negative way. Because, for example, I can do consecutive roasts. When I do sample roasting, maybe I do like 20, 30, 40 samples in a row. And I need to know that my roaster is not building up extra heat. My recipe also needs to consider this, and my cooling time needs to consider this, the kind of preheat that I can do, which is basically checking out how the roaster is doing. If it shows any signs of overheating, letting it have like 20 seconds of rest between roast, or 10 seconds of rest, or zero rest, and trying to adjust this way. But when you do this, and I can do this to a certain degree in my production roaster as well, because we can run a really, really balanced roast in it. You can really get a high clarity and high solubility coffee that doesn't over roast flavor wise, which is really cool. So let's go forward, because now we kind of did the recap and we did a quick introduction of the ghost in the roaster technique, which is really cool if you have the ability to do it. At the very, very end, I just wanted to compare my curve with a super simplified version of of a declining roar curve, which is like standard in the industry for a lot of people. It gives you a lot of clarity. It gives you great development. But I've found which tend to be a tiny bit less dense. When we roast them a bit harder, a bit faster, we get a lot more body, we get a lot more flavor development, which some of these coffees need. And the rounding off of the energy at the end is basically what gives you that silky smooth mouthfeel. That is completely roar based. Yes, you have to have the material in the coffee to be able to get it. So you might have difficulty doing this with lower grade coffees, but you will still see the change in mouthfeel, and how it rounds off, and how it sits in your mouth, and how it makes you salivate while giving you more intensity than a flat style curve, or a declining roar that is quite linear. It's great for some coffees, but most of the coffees here need more. So let's focus on the farm. Let's see what we can actually do and how we can make raw coffee for roasting. So let's push forward. So we have what we call tendencies and modifiers, or I call them that because this is basically my invention. So the tendencies are like the physical reaction of the lot. And that has to do with a lot of things. We can, for example, have lots that take let's push forward. So codependent examples are maturity and solubility. I'm pushing forward. Thank you. So maturity and solubility. The more mature the coffee berry becomes, the fruit, the more solubility you can make out of the coffee, because it's going to be roasting better. Its structure is getting firmer and more solid. There's more material to transfer the heat. And up until a certain point, when the coffee starts drying on the tree and the tolerance for the heat of the roasting starts going down a tiny bit. So this works really well. So if you want, for example, a coffee that is for espresso, but it's not supposed to be so dark, then you harvest a bit earlier. And you basically make it like a almost ripe coffee that roasts well, that keeps CO2 really, really well, because it's sealed well and it doesn't get that porous, but it still has quite a bit of a roast degree without getting to the dark parts. So that's one way you can design an espresso from the beginning to make it work in a specific way, just based on maturity. So the riper the fruit, the higher the solubility. And then you also have a lot of impact on solubility with your processing. So this is only talking about cream coffees, because there's a lot of myths about naturals and how they roast and how they react and how they taste that's based on dirty naturals that haven't been dry milled properly, for example. So a natural coffee, it dries slower, it gets a process that's easier and better in general on the coffee bean. So you get a coffee bean that roasts better when you do a natural process. You just keep it in the berry and you dry it in the berry. Then you can go to pulp naturals, which is one of the most common coffees in Brazil, which is basically a honey, but with no distinction of how much fruit you leave with it. And these roast slower. They don't go as dark in the same system with the same recipe. They don't get the same solubility. They generally don't get the same focusing of the acidity. So you can actually, point to a certain fruit. It becomes very obvious what it is. It's a bit more fuzzy. And then you have the washed coffees, which sometimes work really, really well, but a lot of times they just roast even worse than the coffees. It's basically like they get water damage, they get a bit too much water treatment, and they roast really. How can I say this? A lot of washed coffees are famous for having high acidity, but it's, to me, it's not high acidity. It's a less distinct acidity that has like a sharper peak, and it doesn't have as much information, what I call nutritional information for the body. They can have a high impact, but maybe not the biggest complexity when it comes to acidity. So these are some of the things that I see happening with coffees. So based on process and based on how mature it is. So the modifiers are used to slow down or speed up tendencies. So for example, if we have a coffee that's been grown at altitude, which is really, really dense, it's a bad idea to dry it for 40 days because it's going to become a lot denser. So we can modify this, designing a drying system that takes, 7 to 10 days, working 24/7, so to speak, and getting the coffee to the point it needs to get, depending on what your client wants, depending on what you want out of the flavor, because the closer you are to 12%, the livelier and more vivid will be the flavor profile. And the closer you get to 11, the more stable it becomes, but you also lose a bit of that intrinsic life that the flavor has. And the lower you go, the more stable it becomes, but you also lose that first flavor peak. Let's see here. So we can work, for example, let's see if we want to make a coffee that's fruity with a lively fresh fruit. So let's go back one slide. Sorry, I keep pushing you forward. If you want a lively fruity coffee, we know that we need to, one, get cherries that are quite mature, but not overripe. So that gives us a more lively flavor. Then we can twist this with a fermentation that lasts a little bit longer because there's less sugars available. We maybe need to hydrate the berries properly for them to start fermenting well, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can take them out of the water after 2 or 3 days, depending on the water temperature and how the fermentation is going. And we can continue drying it as a natural because that gives us a higher intensity coffee in general. Then we have to work on how we finish this fermentation because we're taking it out of the water. There's not a lot of sugar left in the fruit. So we might be needing to feed this another culture, getting it onto the raised beds to continue the fermentation for the next couple of days. And then we actually get into the drying properly. So the fermentation stops. It was already a fermentation that was adjusted to a lower temperature to get a cleaner fruit, which also means the yeast culture should, or the bacterial culture should have more difficulty adapting to warmer climates as it's drying. So it should stop sooner. And then we dry it a bit faster so it roasts better. Maybe like 10 days, 5 days on the raised beds and 5 days in a dryer, mechanical dryer like I built this year. And then it comes out ready in about 10 days. And we have a coffee that roasts pretty fast because it was dried a bit faster. So this, in some ways, it makes it easier to roast, especially if it's a high altitude coffee. So we push it back a bit. So that's what I say, we have some tendencies, and then we can apply modifiers to these tendencies. We can kind of play and shuffle our coffee around in the system where we try to affect these tendencies with our modifiers. And there's a lot of them. So application in the roast works. So all of the conditions that I'm going to be presenting, they were roasted in the Icava. There's one roast profile only. They're all the same. There are 2 different samples here, and there's a verification of roast dynamics. So basically, where to lay the blame? Is it my recipe? Is it the coffee? Is it what happened at the farm? And then what we can observe in these recipes, because they're all natural, so we can observe overcharging with heat in both samples. Sample 2 does not have adequate dynamics at all, and both samples will show diminished quality due to roasting. So let's put one slide forward. These are 2 roasts, and then we also have the air roast. So the air roast is obviously the yellow line, the one that bottoms out sooner or with a lower temperature. We can see here that one roast went really, really high, which is the blue one, and the blue one is always the first one in Cropster. So the roaster was a tiny bit less hot, and it had to give a bit more energy because it bottomed out at a lower point in the recipe. And there's also differences between coffees. Some of them bottom out further down than others, but in the Cava, you usually don't see that much of a difference. So if we follow just the yellow profile, which I actually did after all the other ones, we can see that it goes fairly stable from its maximum roar in the beginning, all the way up to about 6 minutes, and then it starts declining, and it declines pretty well in an area where it shows uh, a slight decrease of energy after it starts decreasing. It has some mountain tops there going down, making a slow valley. But you can see that these are not carried forward roasting the coffees. Now, this dynamic might change if we roast the coffees for like another minute. These coffees can stop overcharging with heat. So we might see that this peak we're getting on the blue and the red line after the drying, which basically means we overheated the coffees, but we couldn't see it because the temperature sensor is too covered in cooler moisture to be able to give us a reading. So basically, as soon as we get to 150 degrees, the coffee just goes into high gear, starts developing a lot faster, and a lot faster than it can actually handle because it's above tolerance. This means that we're making our coffee simpler. An 85-point coffee just became an 84-point coffee because it lost solubility, it lost flavor development. And as we're riding too hard for too long, it just keeps on losing. Yes, it keeps on making a bit too fast, so it kind of becomes hollow. And then it keeps losing as well because we have these dips in energy that just steals. So this is an example of how to take two really difficult coffees and see that, yeah, it's more the coffee, like this one, just taking a look at the first one, which has like a huge peak after the heating, and then it's fairly smooth afterwards. Let's push one forward. This one has the same behavior, but not as extreme. And it also finishes off quite well, which means it doesn't have that much uniformity, which we kind of already know. And one more forward. There we have our air roast, and you can see that there's a dip slightly after the drying phase, after 150 degrees. That usually the coffee carries it better forward than this, and you can see the difference between the air temperature and the gray curves underneath. But you can also see that they're declining in a fairly parallel way, which means that we probably need to go slower before, and we need to keep the heat up for a little bit longer. So it should be going from the beginning of the roast, looking just at the squirrely roar curve. We should have been going like maybe 1 or 2 degrees lower from the beginning all the way to the drying, and then going down a bit slower to keep more heat and let the coffee develop better. They would not go into this peak where it starts burning and overdeveloping, and it would not go into the free fall afterwards that gives us less solubility and less flavor. So let's push forward. So this is basically my thank you list, and this is the end of the presentation. Now we can go into Q&A, and we can see if there's time to maybe like do a design coffee. What does the client need, and how can we make it? So I'll push the mic over to Lucia.
Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. I wanted to bring it back to a couple of more kind of universal things because not everybody here is a roaster. A producer who also roasts. I think this is like a very advanced level of.
It's a luxury.
Yeah, it's a luxury. That's a great way to put it. But something that I think that we can more universally take away if you're not quite, if you're a producer that's not quite at the level of roasting, if this doesn't, pique your interest, you're not ready to take that step. Something that I think is really important that you mentioned is a concept that I don't see many people adopting, which is they're very used to or getting more used to doing experimental fermentations, experimental processing, experimental, micro lots. And then what I see is applying the same drying. So they'll do a wash, they'll do a pulp natural, they'll do a natural, they'll do some, extended fermentation, and then the drying is the same. And so I think it's this concept of trying to kind of match or pair a drying protocol with your processing protocol, that there's not the same way one size fits all doesn't work in processing, one size fits all drying may not be the best, way forward. So that the fact that you can have a different drying protocol, like you mentioned, depending on how the coffee was treated beforehand, you may want to have shorter drying time. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is one of the main principles and one of the most important ones. But data is a bit difficult because drying is a huge mess. I mean, I know a lot of countries started this before Brazil, but Brazil kind of killed fermentation a lot of years back with government programs to avoid making Rio defects coffees, which Rio de Janeiro, which is one of the first big producer states, and also Sao Paulo, were quite known for making these terrible coffees because they were growing coffee in inadequate places, too much rain, etc., etc. So all you make is bad coffee. But when you get to the kind of coffees that I like to make, they are coffees that have direction. They have planning. I made it to become in a specific way. For example, I don't like spending my time making nutty coffees because nutty coffees take care of themselves. It's really simple, slow. You can even call it. I'm not going to go there. Um, it's really just about getting a huge mix of all kinds of different maturity levels, not too much green because it really affects the quality of the lot. But it can handle maybe 5%. And 5% is a lot when it comes to communication by gas between unripes and ripes. 5% is a lot already. So you have to be in a really, really, really well ventilated place in the beginning to not have your mature cherries kind of go into rotting because of the gas coming out of the green ones. But it's really simple to make these coffees. What I like to make is fruit forward coffees that are clean, that have good intensity, which is why I loved this suggestion that was made here about combining washed and natural process, getting some of the best from both worlds, which I've done quite a bit this year, and I have some of the first samples ready for testing that I'm going to be doing tomorrow, I think. So when you design these coffees to be even narrower, you want to go to a specific kind of fruit. You kind of make decisions in every part of the process of post-harvesting, and you kind of try to narrow it in to get it exactly where you want it. And when you do this, the coffee starts roasting terribly because it's too uniform. So everything it does in excess, and there's not really that much you can do about it. But you can split these lots up. Or if you're making several small lots, you change the drying scheme, because as you change the drying scheme, you change how the coffee roasts. And then you blend different coffees that have all been pushed in the same direction all the way up to the drying. And maybe you have one drying for 15 days, another one drying for 12 days, one drying for 10 days. And if you have some really high-tech dryers, you can dry a lot faster without doing damage to the coffee. You might lose a bit of shelf life on the raw coffee, but a lot of people prefer having good fresh coffees that roast really well from the beginning. So combining drying schemes is one way to build a shock absorber into the lot so it doesn't do all the stuff all at once.
I think
A really
another,
focused, yeah,
sorry,
really focused crack will just take so much energy away that your coffee becomes nothing.
I think another overlap in our philosophies or our approach to processing is I'm also way more relaxed about underripes. I do definitely fear that, like, for wash coffees, that severe uniformity, because especially when you're getting so much, like you said, if it's so on the line of ripe, it's so uniform, and you're tipping more towards overripe, then you're really losing out on those acids, those natural acids, organic acids from the plant. So you also get a coffee that, yes, you like, I think so many people are focusing on higher sugars, higher bricks, more of that, thinking that that's going to get you those fruitiness and those long fermentations. But what maybe they don't realize is that you're losing out on that acid balance. So the more sugar that the plant develops, it's kind of lowering that acid balance, and then you can end up with these very kind of flat coffees. So I also am very relaxed on when I see harvesting and there's so much effort. Like, if it's easy for you to get these perfectly red ripe cherries, that's awesome. But I see a lot of producers who think that that's the only way to get really high quality coffee, and they're using a lot of energy and resources to get that coffee. And I'm like, let's back off a little bit. Like, let's allow a little bit more of that less ripe, like less ideal coffees, so that they can give us that acid, and then we'll compensate later. We'll do something in our fermentation, we'll do something in drying. Like, we'll kind of, yeah, compensate in other parts instead of, relying on this like super ripe. So I think that's kind of an interesting concept that we started to bring up a little bit in our last session, the concept of you want uniformity because you want reproducibility, you want consistency in your product, but too much uniformity, you're losing complexity and you're losing some of those things that make coffee interesting. So I think it's a fine balance, and it can maybe be confusing when we're saying, be consistent, but don't be too uniform. And you want some diversity and you want complexity, but you want to be able to reproduce it. So it's just kind of acknowledging that it can be, maybe it can sound like a mixed message sometimes. So if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I just have some very, very strong memories of mixed drying schemes. I remember a friend of mine from Norway, uh, Eystein he's a world champion in brewers. And when he won with a past crop coffee that had like 4 or 5 different drying schemes. And the thing was a symphony of everything, but it was just so well matched. It was like, I don't know, the smell of the coffee reminded me of picking blueberries in August in a warm pine forest. Uh, there's a bit of soil, there's a lot of vegetation, there are resins, there are flowers everywhere. I mean, it's just one of my biggest experiences. And people got really upset. It was a past crop Ethiopian with a big mix of drying.
Well, I think that the other thing to mention is that I think it's an advanced level move. I don't know that it's something that any beginner could, easily work with. So I think that's maybe how we can start to integrate this idea where it's like it's possible, but you have to have a certain level of, baseline knowledge to be able to do kind of this expert level thing, which almost seems like the amateur thing to do. It seems like you're doing the mistakes, or not the best recommendations, but you can turn it into something really good. I want to mention one more thing that popped out to me about shelf life that you mentioned, and the importance of having more solubility. So the importance of having ripe fruit, you get more solubility. Processing gives you more solubility. There's more things to take out of the coffee, so that complexity. I think that's one of the mechanisms that helps with shelf life is if you have more starting material, it takes more time for that to, oxidize and degrade over time. So anything that we can do to get more substance in our starting coffee, I think is really helpful in many ways, in more ways than we can maybe even think of. Not just creating a great coffee, roasting it well, but having that coffee for many, many months.
Yeah, and there are some indicators. I was just reading an article the other day, Mr. Theron, and he was discussing using black lights, UV at a certain frequency. I think it was like 300, no, 630. Yeah, I think that was the wavelength, 630 nanometers, for seeing how coffee reflects. And now we have no real great, fantastic answers for how this works. But generally, lots that are dried really fast, that have been pushed really hard, they phosphoresce a lot more or they fluoresce a lot more under this light. So there are some indicators that we can see also. We can always find other ways to corroborate things, which is why I do analysis of the roast curve, which is basically what does the coffee do and what does the coffee need to complete in a better manner. And then I correlate this with what I found in the sensory profile. And when the two hit the same mark, I have a correlation that I'm happy with. I can see the connections in my head, and the coffee presents to me something that I can understand and I can filter. And I can say, for example, this is an 85.5 coffee. But if we complete it a tiny bit more, this dark chocolate is going to become a milk chocolate because it's going to have more support around it. It's going to have more acidity. It's going to have a bit more natural sweetness, even though it's not sugar. And this almost raw cacao or dark chocolate bitter thing will bloom into something sweet and full. So there are many things we can do.
There's a question from Paulo. He wants to ask you, do you harvest by hand or with machines? We're used to Brazil thinking it's machine harvested, but with your operation, do you do anything different?
No, actually, my operation is in the planting stage, so I can only talk about that in 2 years from now. But I've harvested a lot on a lot of farms. And when I'm doing small lots for research and for finding recipes for farmers, I like doing manual picking if that's what they do. But if that's not what they do, it's not going to help me at all, except for seeing the potential. So I might do 20, 30 liter fermentation or something small like that, which is a bit difficult because it's a small mass. But we can do tests to see which ways we want to go. But there's no getting away from the reality of what you're harvesting. So if you're pulling a harvester by tractor, or if you have a automated harvester, or if you're using small machines for helping you harvesting, which is a lot faster. I mean, one person can harvest at least like 8 or 10 people with a tarp on the ground and a machine in his hand. You're really efficient. So it all depends on what reality is, because a lot of people can't do sorting. It becomes way, way, way too expensive. And now you can do sorting for specific projects. I want to win this municipal or state competition. We want to make a coffee that has a different goal. But it has to be economically achievable. It has to be healthy, right?
Yeah, I also want to there's a couple of questions up in the chat. So Dylan was mentioning that there's some research papers that support my thoughts on no hedonic difference between underripe. So if it's a little bit, not the fully red ripe cherries, but if it's a little yellow or pink, and then the overripe. And I think we can all agree that green cherries don't have any positive tasting notes. So we definitely want to keep the green out. But those ones that are just below the threshold of super ripe, again, add some complexity. You're preserving the acidity, and I don't think that it's worth the energy of extra manual sorting or the yield reduction. You're losing coffee by selecting those out. I think that the reason why this maybe goes against kind of conventional advice is that when you're not paying attention, starting with perfectly red ripe cherry is an easy win. But when you have tools, when you are paying attention to your fermentation, when you have other options, then you don't have to be so strict in the beginning. So I think that it's not really contradictory advice. It's just different levels of advice. Like if you aren't going to do very much to your coffee, if you don't have, the opportunity to do much to your coffee, yes, have red ripe cherries. Start that way. That's great advice. But if you are going to pay more attention and you have more tools, then you can relax some of that criteria. Anyway, that's
And
just
if you have control, you can tailor different dryings to the different coffees, and then you can put them back together again afterwards.
I really like that. I think that that's one of the tools that we use the most. Is specialty coffee is all about micro lots, day lots, keeping things as separate as possible. And I really like mixing things back in. What I do in my in the mill is I will have, if I do very simple processing. So we'll do 2 different yeasts. We'll do a SEMA yeast and an Intenso yeast, 2 Saccharomyces yeast in their own tank. They'll have their own fermentation. And then, so I can monitor the fermentation and the yeasts aren't competing with each other. But then when I go to the drying, we'll blend them in right there and they will dry together. And so it's like one level of, mixing. So they'll still have the same drying, but they had different fermentations and it just makes my job a little bit easier. But I really like this concept of being able to blend back in all of those different, components to make something really complex. So I think that this idea of micro lots is supposed to be highlighting, it's supposed to help the producer to say this is highlighting something really special. But the downside of that is that you take away all of these tools that producers can use to improve the complexity of the coffee. So it's a double-edged sword. Like it pretends to be for the producer, but I think it mostly removes choice more than benefits. I want to look at Lowell's question.
It's close to an empty promise. It's not quite, but
that's how I feel too. Yeah. Lowell has a question that says he was sample roasting day lots of coffee from the same farm, same processing. One sample cups much better than the rest. Day lot seems like an outlier. Could be something post-harvest or could be the roast. So that's kind of his question of when you have something that's such an outlier, I guess how do you start to be a detective and think about what could have happened here?
well, if you don't have any obvious problems like defects that really mark the coffees, if you have a really really good lot and you have no idea why this one lot is so good and the other ones are not, then you probably roasted all the other ones in a way that didn't complete them very well. So they're not able to show their true face because you didn't roast them properly. So I think that we need to have data on roasting, and even with like open barrel, super simple roasters that don't even have a thermometer in them. You buy a 50, 60 centimeter thermometer. It should be around 2 millimeter at the end, maybe 2.5. 3 is a bit too thick because it becomes unresponsive. And when you go down below 2 millimeters, all you're going to see is noise. So what you want to do is you want to bend this probe so you can actually mount it on the front of your open barrel roaster with a hose clip. Just screw it on there, and then you adjust it on the inside so it doesn't catch on anything, and it actually stays more or less in the coffee, which is quite difficult with some of these roasters. But at least you're getting good readings. But you might be getting a bit higher reading than is real because you might be getting a big mixture of air in with the beans. If you see higher temperatures than you used to, you can, for example, adjust your computer to read wrong, which is quite easy, just offset by 10 or 15 degrees. Because I've seen some of these old roasters in Brazil when I mount a probe on them and use Cropster to register and work properly. I see a lot of them finishing off coffees around 220 degrees, where I know that in a roaster that's adjusted properly, they're going to be burning by 206 degrees. So I know it's not real, but you can transpose in your head, or you can make an offset on your reading to make it more natural and more real if that's what you want. But we need good data. And all you need is a hose clip and a long sensor that you can bend. Some of them don't bend very well, they're too hard. So you need to find something that actually bends. And then you're good to go. It's not that expensive, and it really pays off because you can start, even if it's not a cava, and even if you can't make it that perfect and that smooth, you get a lot of information and you start understanding your coffees, and you can start seeing the difference between the coffees that taste good and the coffees that taste less good. And maybe you should not be adjusting your flame because you should be adjusting your airspeed, because that has a much bigger impact on how it roasts than adjusting your flame that's in most cases hardly adjustable at all. So just make it happen. That's one of the most important things.
I think this is really, really key and a really important kind of question from Lowell and your reflection, because I have seen so many people or so many occasions where you think maybe it is the post harvest processing. Maybe it was, a poor roast or something didn't get up to temperature or whatever. You blame the processing, and then you go back to the drawing board and you either try something, try a new process, or you just waste time on the wrong thing when like that wasn't the problem. So I think it's really important to have, to be a detective in this way so that you don't waste a harvest or waste resources on the thing that wasn't wrong, the thing that wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
problem.
And remembering that when you're roasting during the harvest and soon after you close down the harvest for the year, you're only getting a preview. I mean, none of us really have perfect dryers. And when you have a perfect dryer, you might be able to get a coffee that's, a few weeks off the drying to taste perfectly, marvelously well in the cup. But maybe it's not going to last as long. So, you could make a competition for coffee for somebody who's going to be competing in 2 or 3 months, and the coffee's going to be absolutely spectacular because it's already good like a month after. But most of us don't have that possibility. So we need to just try to find better solutions to
Mm-hmm.
make things happen. And I'm really happy that I see a lot of other people saying that drying maybe shouldn't exceed 35, 36 degrees. And one of the things that I've been thinking of as more logical is to, what was the highest temperature the coffee suffered while growing? It was 36 degrees for 2 days. Okay, so 36 degrees is going to be my maximum temperature for this year. That means I can't dry in the sun at the end. I have to have shading, or I have to do it in a dryer. Something has to be different.
No, absolutely. And I think this concept too, I also see like some advice that I could give to producers is to taste your coffee, not just in the harvest. I think so many of us are tasting during the harvest. We're making sure there's no problems, there's no defects. It's kind of up to quality, and then you can ship the coffee out, and then you maybe get a break and don't think about it until the next harvest. But something that's been really important for us is to taste that coffee, even if it's sold, even if it's gone, to keep some back and continually taste it every couple of weeks. I mean, we drink it every day because it's what we have. But if you're not into that protocol, just taste it really frequently to see how your coffee changes. Because some of the training that I've brought into coffee from winemaking is when you're tasting really fresh wine, you have a lot of components. You have a lot of alcohol, you have a lot of tannin, and you know that this thing needs to last 10, 15, 20, 25 years. So when we're tasting, we're not always tasting what the wine is today. We're trying to see into the future and try to match this is what this is going to turn into. So you're kind of projecting into the future. And I think that that could be really helpful as like a coffee philosophy as well, to taste what is this going to become. And that's really, it's something that just kind of happens with experience. I can't really tell you that if you taste this, it becomes this, at least not yet. But it's one of those things that you have to build up over a couple of seasons is, 9 months later, 12, 15 months later, this is the flavors that I get from my coffee, bringing that back to what you were tasting in harvest. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This last year, somebody put me to the test inside of Oop, our company where we have cafes and a roastery. Um, they found some old coffee that had been taken out of a store in like August 2023, no, 24. And it was just lying around in my wife's car for until December when somebody took it out. And then in January or February, somebody's like, I can't throw this away. Let's taste it. And it's like tasting amazing. It was tasting much better than the year's harvest because 23 to 24 was terrible. And 22 to 23 was actually better. It was still going down, but it was a lot better. The coffee that I roasted in August, it was kicking around in the car, getting hot, getting cold, getting hot, getting cold for half a year. It was a lot better than the coffee we were roasting at the time from the same producer, same lot, same everything. So that's one thing. So that led me to thinking, maybe I should roast 6 months worth of coffee. So that I have like in February I roast everything, and then I try getting some new coffees in July if possible. And then I don't roast in March, April, May, June, when all these coffees have already started dying, because you might have a fantastic lot, but one day around midday, the farmer left that natural lot under the sun for more than 15 minutes without raking it and changing the temperature. And that top 10% of the lot died from overheating. So that 10% will give you a small decrease in intensity because it just fried. It's not there anymore. It's not going to roast that well. It doesn't have that much information. It's already dead and degrading. Unlike the other ones who are not dead and they're not degrading quite as fast. They're actually getting better because the water distribution is getting better. So, that would be a dream, roasting all my coffees at the peak during the year, and then maybe keeping them in a big freezer until we start selling, and then have a step down process with different temperatures, which is quite important when you want to stabilize water. So you can't just go from super cold to normal. It takes a while.
That's a great point. And I kind of want to bring this back to another comment that Dylan has on the chat about UV light. And he's mentioning, and this is my understanding as well, that UV light predominantly shows mold and fungal damage. And he says, in my experience, usually due to poor storage or poor drying practices. And I think that I've also used the little UV light to kind of assess some coffees and the connections that I've made. Yes, a lot of microbial activity will fluoresce and we'll have these bright like spots on the coffee, as well as physical damage. So if there's a lot of pulp or damage, or this was coffee that was like driven over with a tractor that has a lot of stress, that will also fluoresce a lot. And that doesn't necessarily always correlate to low quality. So I've had cuppings where some of these coffees that fluoresce really brightly are also incredibly expressive and incredibly fruity. So I think that there's a connection with like physical damage where a lot of those soluble, that material is like more available. It's like more readily available. So it kind of expresses itself and people can like those coffees. But what I have correlated it to is reduced shelf life. So if those coffees are so like showy and expressive right at that moment, then they're not, and also they're physically compromised, right? We've damaged the structure. They're not going to last those 18 months in storage because they're already kind of spilling their contents. So it's something to keep in mind. I think a lot of people want to use UV as like, oh, it fluoresces a lot, it's a bad coffee. But I think we have to be careful about how we use this tool. It can be a really great coffee for a certain purpose. Like you were saying, if you know it has, for a competition, it just needs to show well this one time, that's not a problem. It doesn't need to last 18 months. So anything you
Yeah,
want to
and
say?
if it's a fruit, yeah, if it's a fruit forward red coffee that was pushed really hard, either fermentation or drying or mechanically, you're probably going to get that strawberry coffee that kind of tastes like strawberries and Quakers, and that doesn't fulfill you in any way. It's kind of like an empty shell, and it can go to like rotten really fast. So, you start drinking it, but your body doesn't want it. It's difficult to drink. And if it goes to the yellow side, it probably goes to pineapple.
I like that. So we're almost out of time. I don't know if anybody else wants to say hi or ask your own questions, or you can keep putting them in the chat and I'll just keep popping them in. Because otherwise, I want to, I guess, maybe talk about this idea that you brought up about how our body reacts to coffee. And I know that you have a lot of, what's that called? Well, developed thinking about this interaction between the plant and the body. So I just wanted to give you space to talk about that a little bit more. You were mentioning like acidity being information for the body.
Yeah, so I've been looking a lot at how I react. I've been looking at how different fruits have different compositions, how different fruits have different pH levels, how different kinds of acids make us salivate in different ways. All these things. You pick a bit from SCA, you pick a bit from here, you pick a bit from there. You participate in some courses to learn some stuff. You talk to other professionals. You read a whole lot of literature and a lot of research, but there's not a lot of research on this specifically, how we as human beings have a fairly uniform and universal reaction to different kinds of stimuli, especially flavor, but I think also aroma. So I think that the acidity is the number one marker that the body needs to understand natural fruits, especially when it comes to legumes, fruits, vegetables. This balance between sweetness and acidity is the most important part, because you salivate the best with some of the acids we like the most. You can even pass a triangulation test on acid just based on how you salivate. This, as long as you can memorize it, that acetic acid will have your mouth reacting in one way, and citric in another way, phosphoric in a third way, and they're all very distinct. You can actually taste the coffee. It's like, okay, here we probably have of the acidity that I can taste, it's a 30% acidic. There's quite a bit of citric, and then we have some phosphoric at the bottom that actually helps elevate everything and makes it more, gives us more body, more presence, more intensity, a better link between aroma and flavor. I feel that phosphoric does that to me, kind of strengthens the bond and betters the integration between the two. So you can see a lot just by how your body reacts. So how you salivate is one thing. How you feel when this coffee goes down your esophagus and goes down into your stomach is another thing. How does your stomach react? How does my body react? Am I getting the shivers because my body's going to, ooh, this is really dry, and the acidity is not really, anything. Kind of, it's just, well, it's acidic, but what is it? It kind of has as much information as like flat, warm, bubbly water.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's acidity there, but there's no information, so the body doesn't have anything to, the body can't make anything out of it. It doesn't see it as nutritional. It might give you a good sensation, refreshing your mouth or whatever else, which is also a pH issue. But there's no information there. So as we go to citric is really good to have in a coffee, but citric just means that we didn't really get anywhere. There's no narrowing, there's no honing of the flavor profile. As we make changes and pick the coffee clean and ferment it in a certain way, and we dry it in a certain way, we can make this much more impactful, and we can try to get towards a certain classification of fruits. Could be red fruits, could be yellow fruits, or we could try for pineapple, we could try for mango, we could try for papaya. And all these things, they need something a little bit different. For you to get to papaya, you need like extreme maturity in the fruit without it passing the point. Just like geisha, that doesn't taste like geisha. If you don't get it at the right ripeness level, you're not going to taste the geisha in it. It's not going to be that marked. So also some varieties are extremely dependent on their level of maturity in the fruit to be able to express these things.
I hadn't heard that perspective about, and I agree with you that citric is that you didn't really do anything because citric is what the plant has. So you've just, I guess that would be like the coffee purist, like transparency, where you
Yeah,
just kind of like take
yeah,
a cherry from the field and then you put it in the cup. Like there was no impact on kind of, the other parts of processing. So I think that citric, yeah, is kind of like that sign of if that's all you have, then you really haven't left your imprint on the coffee. Um, I also think it's interesting what you're saying, and I think this also is another place where our philosophies overlap, where I really want to reinforce or like kind of bring back the body as an instrument of information. And so often we're very, especially in coffee, I think we love technology and toys, and there's so many like fun things to play with. But a lot of times we forget that our own body is a really great instrument. And right now I'm in the midst of my annual, semi-annual coffee like reset because I want to keep my body sensitive. I want to keep my body, paying attention to the clues. And I think so much of coffee is like getting louder and louder and louder and just more. So my philosophy is making coffees that are a little bit quieter, but then also keeping myself kind of tuned so that I can pick up on those clues. So is there anything you want to say about
yeah.
that?
In my case, it's very specific because my body has a huge problem with inflammation and it has always had. So, for example, if I eat meat on a daily basis, I can't get my noise level down enough to be able to feel my body properly. That's very, very different from person to person. Some people can eat meats and have no problems at all. Some people need to be really restrictive to be able to do this. So I need really, really clean, good quality foods to be able to do this. And I need to treat myself well. I need to sleep well. Um, and the better I get, the better readings I get because my noise level goes down and I can see all the spikes much in a much better way. Things become much more clear and I can start like, this should have had a bit more intensity because I'm comparing the level of solubility I get with the temperature that I got and the time of development that I got in the coffee and analyzing how the coffee beans, the different ones in the same small lot of 60 grams, how they colored in properly. And I can see that, there are inconsistencies here. So probably 10 to 15% of this lot overheated in the sun. So it's the coffee that's probably going to start going bad around January, February. Now it was a lot that had like 30% damage, which has a lower intensity. It's much more vegetal. It's much more like dried vegetable matter, like hay, for example, or wood. These things are going to start coming in much sooner because there's a much bigger part of that lot that was damaged, and you can see some of these things very early on, even straight from the drying. Though it gets a lot easier a couple of months after. So the flavor tells us a lot, and how our body reacts tells us so much. I mean, how the body reacts needs to be the baseline for how we think and how we design coffees. At least the way I think of things, because you're the one drinking the coffee. You are the baseline. So what have you done to define your baseline? Sometimes I smell my decanter and I smell my filter and I smell it before I rinse it and after I rinse it. And like, okay, so this is my background. This is what I'm going to smell together with my coffee. I can still smell the paper. There's memory in the glass. So the glass is going to have something. I didn't clean it with caustic soda between yesterday and today. So it's not zeroed, or you can flame treat it, which is also quite good for cupping cups. If you have glass cupping cups, they can become quite smelly after a while. You can just torch them quickly and you zero them. If you go to high quality borosilicate glass or crystal, you're not going to have that problem. But normal glass is quite dirty.
There's a comment for Lowell was talking about a friend brought him some black licorice. He had a coffee that tasted like black licorice, and it's something that is like stuck in his memory. I've never had a coffee like that. Have you?
I have had coffees like that. It's something that can happen, maybe let's call it naturally. Um, it's not that uncommon. If you have a coffee that's not that dark roasted, used for espresso, and you make an extremely small ristretto, like we're talking like 7 to 9 drops going onto the bottom end of your espresso cup just to fill it up properly. There's hardly anything at all. If you put that in your mouth, it's going to be like salty licorice together with all kinds of other things. But it's something that I've seen many times, usually extraction based. And I've seen some, yes, and maybe they weren't like licorice, but there are those small seeds, um, like cumins, that they use a lot of in India, for example. You can go in that direction, which is quite similar. So it happens, but I have no idea why. I wouldn't be able to provoke it into happening.
Yeah. Well, so he was saying it's coffee that still makes him drool just thinking about it. And I'll take a chance or advantage of being here with Jack because Jack Ray had brought us a pink bourbon from Colombia that is it's still seared in my brain as one of like the coffees that blew us away. We were just talking about this last night with a group of friends where you'll have a coffee that is just like I don't know, a star that sears a memory into your brain and it's something that you remember for a really long time. So I want to thank Jack for giving us that experience. It's still something that we think about. And okay, it's
Yeah,
11.
why shouldn't coffee be like art, or like a symphony orchestra or like a ballet? You know, it catches you and it makes you cry and makes you connect and makes you be a part of what's happening and truly live and appreciate the experience. And why is coffee any different?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And I think we're getting more of those coffees and it's also, making our instruments more sensitive to be able to pick that up. Like those coffees are out there. It's like, are we doing our part to perceive them? Anyway, thanks everybody for joining. This was a super fun discussion. You guys always make my Fridays so much more fun and I love this community. So, thanks for the awesome information. I think maybe next time I'll just set it up or we can talk about it in the chats. I know I said you wanted to do a protocol. You wanted to do design a coffee that maybe we could all kind of work on together. So maybe you can give us some instructions and think about that.
So go over the replay of the last one, and when this replay drops, just take another look and go forward, go backwards, think a bit. Try to make up a recipe that has logic to you, and see if you have the guts to present it quickly. And we can try to design one together using different kinds of principles, and then we can see who has the possibility of testing this out at some point.
I love that. And yeah, we're getting close to our harvest. I think we're going to have an earlier harvest, maybe something in November, early December we'll have some fruit. So I
We
really
sure did.
Yeah, so I want to try creating a protocol or creating an experiment, also kind of matching the process and having a really different drying experience and then putting those, like really pushing my drying to be different. I want to do something like that. So, anyway, guys, come up with some creativity and we'll be back here in 2 weeks and we can chat about that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Ciao, ciao.
Bye bye.